Welcome back to another episode. In today's podcast, we're going to be focusing on general midfielders and we're going to be looking at some player comparisons. So tonight it's just going to be Tom and I, and we're going to look at some of the main midfielders going from most expensive to some of the less expensive mids that are all on people's watch lists for this preseason. So first off, we got the two highest scoring midfielders and SuperCoach players in general, in Laird and Oliver. And so who would you, if you had to pick one of these two in your team, because they do take up a fair bit of the budget, which one would you be selecting if you could only pick one?
Personally, I've got Oliver in my side at the moment at M1. Obviously, he's got a bit of issues with the tag. He's obviously been tagged out in a few games. But you might have a differing opinion to this, Jonas. But obviously, Laird is priced a little bit higher. It's a tough one because I have enough cash in the bank at the moment to shift Oliver to Rory Laird with no dramas. But I just feel that Oliver, his ceiling's a little bit higher. He's able to get those 170s quite comfortably, but it's a tough one. It's one of those sex series just playing up. It's recognised my voice. It's one of those things where it's a tough one because they're so even. Their ceilings and floors are pretty much identical. But I think the way Melbourne finished off that finals campaign, I think they've got a point to prove next year with Brody Grundy and Max going tandeming in the ruck could spell disaster for other teams. But I'm just edging towards Oliver as a little bit cheaper. Obviously, you could play devil's advocate and suggest that Rory Laird, because of how consistent he is, his price won't deviate as much. And Oliver, you kind of expect a drop at some point when he gets tagged out of a few games. But yeah, I think I'll be leaning towards Oliver, but I could be easily swayed depending on how preseason goes. But what are your thoughts on that, Jonas?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I don't think you can go wrong with either of them, but I do think personally having one of them in your teams is always a good option because they're going to provide good VC and C scores. If you start neither of them, it's going to be tough to find a consistent captaincy option in the first few weeks before you're doing upgrades. So I reckon definitely picking one is the way to go. Personally, I prefer Laird purely because I know he won't really get tagged. He doesn't cop too much attention. And when he does, he seems to deal with it pretty well. I don't see his role getting played around with too much. He should still be the main man in that midfield. And with Adelaide getting a bit better, potentially more victories, that could see a tick up in Laird scoring. So, yeah, I'd be leaning towards Laird, but Oliver's also a very good option with Grundy coming in. His scoring is probably just going to go up a bit more. He's in the prime of his career. But I do like the pod aspect of Laird, and I feel like, say, Oliver starts slightly subpar, like only scoring 110, 115, and Laird continues on his way, that can give you a good point of difference. And also, Oliver's scoring does fluctuate a bit more, which means you should have the opportunity to pick him up at a cheaper price. But yeah, we'll move on to the next two players that we're going to be comparing.
We got Miller and Neale. Obviously, these two, Q Clash, they're big rivals up in Queensland. Miller started off the season pretty slow, and people thought, if there's something wrong with him. But he's, finished the rest of the season ridiculously well with the average of 120. And obviously, Lachie Neale, now with Dunkley in the side, who knows what will happen if it provides a bit more cover for Neale, being less of a target with Dunkley in. But obviously, I think you had both in your side. I think I had as well. What are your thoughts on those two if you had to pick two, or is one clearly in your radar, or do you have any considering that we've got a fair few price at this point that we can all start in our top bracket of midfielders?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. With the Miller one, I think we're just going to have to wait and see on what happens when it's his buy, because I think he has the first buy, but if it's still best 22 players and you've got Gold Coast and Geelong players, that's going to set you back because you're going to have to fill in 4 extra spots than what you normally would in an 18-person buy. So if it is a 20, if Herald Sun come out and say that during that buy, we need to have 22 players on field, I'm steering clear of Miller until after his buy because you're just going to be at a disadvantage and people are just going to bring him in after the buy and you're going to be 1 premium scorer down. So we'll have to wait and see on that. But say it is the case that it's 18-person scoring, I'd be in favour of Miller. He's a bit younger. Gold Coast will be a bit better because Ben King's going to be in that team, shoring up the forward line. So I can only see Miller getting better. And as for Neil, I want to see in the pre-season what happens with Brisbane's midfield. He won't get moved out, but I'm not sure how much scoring is going to get distributed to Dunkley and away from Neil. We saw what Dunkley did, taking some points away from Bontempelli and McRae and some of the other Bulldogs midfielders when he was injured. I feel like that could repeat itself here at Brisbane. Do you have a different opinion on that?
Yeah, similar. I mean, I've got Miller in at the moment. Whether or not I'm kind of tempted to. He's probably the one that. Oh, it's him and Steele. One of him or Steele, which we'll touch on Jack Steele later. But it's one of those two. I think that will get pushed potentially to someone a little bit cheaper that I can redistribute elsewhere. Miller's probably my bet out of the two, just because. I mean, he was so consistent. He obviously had his niggles and what have you. At the start of the season, but he kind of, if anyone wanted to trade him last year, I think they got burnt pretty badly towards the middle and end of the year. He finished the year ridiculously well and was probably unlucky to poll, in the Brown to be in that Brownlow podium and where he was. But yeah, Neil, he's an interesting one because part of me thinks that Dunkley there can provide a bit of cover and help Neil, but having said that, Dunkley pretty much I would seem to see as guaranteed to play midfield minutes. Obviously, Jared Lyons was brought in a couple of years back and he kind of pegged out of that role pretty badly. I think he's on the outer now in regards to that selection for the starting 3 mids, but I think Dunkley was guaranteed to be there. As you said, who knows what happens to the point distribution. We saw last season when Neil, when he gets tagged out of it, he can go ridiculously quiet at times. He's an accumulator, not someone who can get the ball at his own will. And I think Miller does that very well. And you kind of know what to expect from Miller. So, yeah, I'd say Miller's obviously, as I said, 15K, slightly cheaper. But I'd probably move towards Miller if I force my hand. But I have Miller in my starting side anyway. So,
yeah. When you're looking at these midfielders, not a lot separates them, and you can't really go off too much intel in the preseason games because they're just star midfielders. So the only thing you can really look at is their buy structure, if it suits your team, and also potentially like starting price a bit, but also their early fixture. And the one thing that helps Neil, for instance, is Brisbane play Melbourne, Western Bulldogs, Collingwood, who all don't tag, and then also North Melbourne in the first 5 games. So if you do go with Neil, there is the ability that he will go a bit larger than some of these other midfielders. And at the end of the day, you're probably going to be picking these midfielders like Neil in your final team. So you probably want that scoring early on when he's playing the weaker teams rather than when he's got, say, some of the more difficult teams to score against later on in the year. But yeah, now we move on to these 2 Bulldogs midfielders. And do either of these take your fancy?
I've got Bond at the moment, as a few people do. I think the leaving of Dunkley helps Bond a fair bit. I think he probably gets forced his hand a bit more in the midfield. And as we all know, he's kind of champion data's love child in a sense where he just gets gifted points for absolutely nothing. So yeah, he's one that I think you could almost have more confidently in your side than we had last season. Obviously, last season people are like, whether does he play more forward or whatever, with a full complement of Dogs midfielders. But I think with Dunkley gone, he could spend more time in the middle, and we all know how damaging he is in the middle. He can basically win games off his own foot. But I don't know, the other one, obviously McRae, he's one that suffered a lot last season with the rotation of the Dogs. He played a fair bit on the wing, had stints in the half forward and rarely got a full complement of midfield minutes. He was kind of rotating on and off, and it was frustrating, seeing him half the time on the bench as well. He'd often start quarters on the bench and get stuck on there for a while, which impacted his scoring. But, who knows? It could well be that Macrae gets back his midfield minutes and almost plays full-time mid next year without Duncan. So it's kind of hard to say what will happen. But you've got obviously Liberatore in there, which is a big factor. He basically plays full-time mid and only gets to the bench for a rest and then comes back on the mid. But it'll be interesting to see whether they just use, Bontempelli, Macrae and Libba as their main three. Or if there is some rotation with Bailey Smith and things like that, just to change it up. Because, the one thing I felt with the Dogs last season was that they kind of suffered a bit too much in their midfield to their own detriment because they were rotating so much. So whether or not they decide to stick with a consistent three and then rotate when they're off the bench, is yet to be seen. But it'll be interesting to see. But I think Bont, I've kept in from the start, and I think I'll keep him there. He's just capable of tearing games apart, and his average speaks for itself. But what are your thoughts on those two Dogs players, or have you got any in your side at the moment?
Yeah, I also like the look of Bontempelli. I think there's certainly upside. The one thing I'm curious about with Macrae is what happens now that Hunter's out of the team. Will Macrae get pushed out to playing on the wing a bit more and alternate with Bailey Smith there, which will probably correlate to lower scoring? That's something I want to see as well, because there's been rumours that Daniel's been training with the midfield group.
Yeah.
Also, I'm not entirely sure as to what will happen, but I'm pretty confident they don't need Bontempelli up forward anymore, given they're bringing in Lob, for instance, and Bruce will maybe go down back. And then there's like a plethora of tall options that they've got either down back or up forward. So I feel like they're going to have to use Bontempelli in the midfield even more, because he is a bit of a unique player, whereas Macrae is a bit more one-dimensional. So I'm not too sure as to what will happen with that. I think, I'm leaning towards Bontempelli, but Macrae is not the worst option either. He should see an uptick in his scoring. I don't think he's 22 average there, as it says, is 127.1. But look, if you can get back to something like that, that he was capable of a few years ago.
That might have been a mistake. I think I didn't edit it properly from the previous one.
He's got some great scoring history, so certainly a good option and a bit of a unique at this stage with all the other premium mids that are on offer. Yeah,
I mean, you can't go wrong with either one. And, if you pick Macrae early, and it could be a good point of difference moving forward.
Yeah, and he's very injury prone either, which helps.
Yeah. I think this one is probably one that will cause a lot of discussion moving forward into pre-season. You've obviously got the likes of Jack Steele and Paddy Cripps, who are very similarly priced in the lower end of the 600k, who are both capable of scoring, upwards of a 120 average when they're on their best. Obviously, they come with their injury concerns. Paddy Cripps basically made out of paper mache on his shoulders. And Steele apparently, as some of you may have heard on social media, has been training with that fluoro cap, which basically means he can't be tackled in a contact drill. So he's obviously having some issues with his contact issues. Who knows what that may be, but it could be his shoulder from last season. But what are your thoughts on those two? Obviously, Steele, I mean, I've seen photos on social media being a Saints fan, but he's pretty lean. He's leaned down a fair bit. He looks fitter from what he was last season, almost like he carried it throughout the season, and it kind of impacted his fitness. But Cripps, obviously, with the news of Walsh, who knows if he's back by round one, it would definitely impact his preseason with his back concern. Do you think Cripps can start the year as well as he did last year with Walsh? I think was out of the team at the start of last year as well. So what are your thoughts on those two? And if you had to pick one, who would you go for?
Yeah, they're both options that have certainly good value, but both of them have a bit of durability concern. And I feel like with Cripps, his scoring's fluctuating so much. I'm not sure what his average was in the second half of the year, but it wasn't very good. Like, I'd be guessing around 105, which is not top 8. So I'm not too sure about Cripps at this stage. He always seems to sort of tail off towards the back end of the year. At least that's what I believe happens. He starts hot, but I'm not sure if he's a good starting option. I'd more wait and see on how he's going and then maybe commit towards the later end of the year when you don't have to worry about him getting injured, because now he did a hamstring last year, albeit pretty minor, but yeah, I'm not too sure. He can get swung forward a bit, and whilst Walsh will be out, Hewitt's back in, which is another midfield rotation, with also Doherty potentially playing in there as well. So he's certainly one that could get that sort of Bontempelli treatment from last year, where he's playing up forward for like 10 minutes in a quarter. I don't hate the pick, but yeah, I think they're more they're safer picks in my opinion, and I think Steele is that. I just need to see him in the preseason actually like fully commit to tackling, and also I'm curious as to Ross Lyon's game plan. Like, is it going to be like Collingwood where the midfielders sort of are just tasked with getting the ball forward and focusing on territory, or is there going to be more possession? Because if it is that Collingwood sort of game plan, then I'll definitely avoid Steele. And another thing about Steele is I'm not sure if he'll start the year as hot because of some of the St Kilda injuries at the moment. Like, for instance, there's no Max King. Hayes will be out. I feel like St Kilda might be a bit weaker, but in saying that, he presents good value. So definitely top 8 potential, and at low 600 could be worth the risk. I just want to see how his body is during the preseason competition. How about you? Are you concerned about Steele's lack of contact drills?
Yeah, I mean, that was the first I heard of it online, so that was a little bit concerning. As I said, I don't really know what the issue is, or if there is a bit of issues from last year playing up again. If that's the case, unfortunately, I don't think I'll probably move him on to someone a little bit cheaper, which we'll talk about later on. But yeah, I guess the main concern moving forward is our ruck concern, which is a big problem at the moment, which we'll talk about in the next podcast about the rucks. Because originally I wasn't too fussed with Jack Hayes in there, because obviously that means Marshall probably still plays a fair bit forward, fair bit on ruck. But now Hayes is out for 8 to 10 weeks, so he'll miss a few more games at the start of the season. I think King's expected to come back around round 5, which is not the worst in the world. It's definitely not a lot better than what we thought originally. But obviously places serious question marks on our ability to ruck effectively, because Tom Campbell's no spring chicken, and Marshall by himself is obviously what we want moving forward. But how much can he ruck without having to have a reprieve? There has been rumours that Matty Allison is a draft pick from a couple of years back. He's it was training as a high defender earlier, but he's been transformed into a forward, it seems like, just because of the issues we've had. If we're able to kind of make do with Battle potentially swinging forward and then forcing Cordy into the team and playing in defence, that could work. I think as a St Kilda supporter, my gut feeling is I think we still want to try Marshall as a permanent ruck. I don't think we want to rely him going forward and having to play a Tom Campbell more than a game. And obviously, I mean, the reason why Jack Steele did so well a couple of years back in our finals campaign was because Paddy Ryder was there and he was able to provide silver service to Steele in particular. So he's one I think that I'm a little bit concerned about. But as you said, I probably would pick him ahead of Cripps just because of the amount of midfielders they have at Carlton, and obviously the Walsh factor as well. And he died out as well, Cripps, towards the end of the season, as you said, through nagging concerns with his injuries. But yeah, Steele is one I'd pick ahead the two, but I'd pick with caution just because of its potential injury risk and what might happen in the whole Ross Lyon game plan and ruck factor as well. But I guess moving forward, so we've obviously got the likes of, as I said, LDU and Tom Mitchell, who are a little bit
cheaply priced at the kind of mid to 500 range. I'll probably throw in another name in Christian Petrarca. I'm not exactly sure what he's priced this year. I think he's similarly priced.
It's about 610 or something.
Yeah, so he's similarly priced, I think, to Steele and Cripps, but I'll throw him in as well. What are your thoughts on those three in particular, and is there any standout that you could potentially bring in, or are you kind of thinking that these three are roughs in the water where you're not sure how they'll go, and you kind of want to wait until you see practice matches? But do you think they're a valid replacement for someone like a Jack Steele or even a Took Miller, that they can average similarly and you're saving yourself essentially 50 to 60k?
Yeah, I definitely think they are decent replacements. If I had to rank them from worst to best in terms of options factoring in price, I'd go Mitchell last, Petrarca second, LDU first. Just quickly with Mitchell, he's a bit older now. The Collingwood game plan doesn't really tailor towards mass disposal. So whilst he'll be getting that first touch, I don't know if there's going to be a lot of sharing of the pill. And I don't think one Collingwood player averaged above 100 last year.
Yeah.
So for me, that's immediately concerning. Unless he comes out in a preseason game and gets 40 touches, I won't even entice picking Tom Mitchell. As for Petrarca, I actually don't mind the option because he was playing through injury a lot of last year. And once again, like Oliver, Grundy's coming in to help him, and he's going to have a full injury-free preseason, so should be raring to go. The only thing with Petrarca is his scoring still fluctuates. Even during the year when he wasn't injured, he was occasionally prone to scoring a 70 or an 80, which makes me think, is he a great starting pick? Because with these premium midfielders, you want to be picking them knowing that other people who don't pick them can't pick them up for 50, 70k cheaper, because then you almost lose out on the pick. So for that reason, I'm not fully in love with that pick, but I do prefer it to something like a Cripps, because Cripps is now sort of susceptible to soft tissue injuries, which is far more likely to occur than, I think Petrarca cracked a bone in his shin or something like that.
Yeah.
Once that fully heals, it's unlikely for that to reoccur. So for that reason, I prefer Petrarca. But yeah, LDU I think is the best out of the bunch, purely because he's still peaking. I feel like Mitchell's on the decline and Petrarca peaked when Melbourne won the grand final. LDU still has another few years of improvement left in him. I think Clarkson might help him. He finished the season well as well. He ran it out well, unlike Petrarca, and Mitchell was just average throughout the whole year. So I think he averaged 110 plus post buy. So that's always great. The only thing I want to see with LDU is I'm not sure if he's actually capable of copying attention. The tag.
Yeah, that was what I was going to mention.
Yeah, and I think will be coming his way. But yeah, if I had to select one, it would be LDU, purely because he's 60k cheaper than Petrarca.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair shout. I'd be probably the similar. Mitchell down the bottom and Petrarca and LDU second and first, respectively. I mean, Mitchell was a hard one because I think I've seen on social media that from training reports, he's predominantly playing a pretty important midfield role. Whether they're slightly tinkering with the game plan to suit Mitchell a bit better is yet to be seen. But, similar to potentially what Ross Lyon might do at St Kilda with Collingwood's slingshot game plan, it doesn't really suit guys like Mitchell who are so reliant on just getting loose ball where they can. In regards to Petrarca and LDU, Petrarca, I mean, I owned last season. He was all right, but the main issue was he was playing a fair bit forward, which then he was reliant on goals to get a decent score. He was always able to kind of push through to, anywhere between that 90 to 130, but he lacked that consistency, I think. But as you said, he was suffering from a few niggles here and there. So whether or not that means he plays full-time mid next year is yet to be seen. But I think from what I saw from Demons games, it just seems that they almost like him better as a half forward just because of how dangerous he is forward of centre. And I don't think it helps with Angus Brayshaw being in the midfield group. I've heard rumours that he's predominantly training in the midfield group, which impacts, obviously, the rotation of Petrarca. But I think Melbourne see him as a much more dangerous half forward who often, play stints in the midfield when they need him to, rather than a full-time mid. But yeah, LDU's, someone I would like to pick, but it almost feels like you're picking him because of the hype around him, like that people have just created off SuperCoach. Yeah. He obviously had that breakout year, or I wouldn't say breakout year, but breakout year SuperCoach-wise last season. And some of the stuff he does on field's ridiculous. He can tear open games in a pretty crappy North Melbourne side. The only risk, as you said, is we haven't really seen much attention being put on him, partly because of how bad North Melbourne's been. But he's one that I would like to see under Alistair Clarkson. I could see him blossom a fair bit, but it's, whether he can kind of consistently score those 120s and 130s. But with his game style, it almost feels a bit like Petrarca, where he's a bull in midfield, but he can often, die out a little bit in matches and kind of phase out, and that's impacting his scoring. But also I don't think he's predominant up front as a Petrarca, where he can score, 3 goals in a quarter and really turn the score on its head. But yeah, I guess moving on to the uniques, I mean, you can talk a bit about this, Jonas, about these two.
Yeah, sure. So I feel like Tom Green's actually pretty popular, and you can compare him a lot to the LDU pick as well. To me, I wouldn't go close to Chad Warner just yet. I think he's too risky. And there's still plenty of players in that Sydney makeup of the midfield, like Rowbottom, Parker, and Mills, for instance, just to name a few. Errol Goulden sometimes goes through there. So I want to probably wait. I think this is 1 year too early for Chad Warner. I think when Parker retires, he'll be a very good option. But at the moment, yeah, he's one of those players where he'll deliver some great scores, but I'm not sure he'll average enough to be a keeper, which is what you need at 532. In contrast, Tom Green has the whole midfield to himself. He's pretty hard to tag. And so for that reason, I'll be much more in favour of selecting Tom Green than, say, Chad Warner, who has to compete against a few other decent midfielders in his side. The thing with Green is, yeah, he's a bull. He has a great ceiling. Like, he scored 164, but albeit in round 1. But I'm still not sure as to his fitness level, because he sort of dropped off towards the end of the year, and struggled to run out games, unlike LDU. And also, how good will GWS be as a team? I feel like they could regress a bit even further this year, and that might mean that as a team there's less points to go around at GWS. But in saying that, I still think Tom Green will lift his average. It's just a matter of by how much, and I think at that price, I think he's 530 as well. At that price, you need him to be scoring, say, roughly 110 to be a keeper. And I think at this point in time, I'd rather pay a tiny bit more for a proven player with history of running out games, such as like a Steele, or a player who had a bit of a better back end of 2022, like LDU. But how about you?
Yeah, it's a tough one because obviously there's not much difference between these guys and the next ones above. Warner, I similar to LDU, obviously a little bit less confident on Warner than I am with LDU. He's, I think, a bit on the hype train as was LDU. I think the issue with him is he has sparks of brilliance, but it lacks that consistency. It lacks that, consistent 28 disposal game where he can chug along at 100 to 105 or above. And he kind of relies on, say, a 28 possession and 3 goal performance to really score a high score, and he often goes missing at times. He just seems to be that link in the chain often that creates that speed for Sydney. But as I said, sometimes he falls out quite heavily with his scoring just because he gets lost in games sometimes. And as you said, he's probably a year too young at the moment to really burst up. But it'd be an interesting pick to see how he goes. I just wouldn't have the ball to do it. I'm almost more inclined to move down a bit. If I were forced to pick, like a Warner type, I'd almost take a punt on James Rowbottom at a lower score. He dominated, I think, towards the back end of the last year, and was close to scoring 100 plus per game in the last, I think it was 5 or 6 rounds, and looked really consistent. He was much more consistent with his disposal gathering than Warner was. I think Warner's more of that Petrarca-esque type of player where he's a bit reliant on goals and things like that. But I'd be more confident in Tom Green if I were forced to pick the two. As you said, they've got the midfield to their own now with the likes of Taranto and Hopper out. He's basically forced to play full-time mid now. And Cornelio, as we'll talk about later on in our series, with the forwards, but I think those two will play a predominant role in the Giants having any comeback in the season. But as you said, I think they'll struggle a fair bit just because they probably lack that third or fourth mid to rotate through. And as we talk about, we come back to that taggability factor. We actually haven't seen much pressure put on Tom Green when he plays. So who knows what will happen. But I think if I had to pick between the two, I'd be much more confident with Green than Warner just with consistency's sake, because you can kind of guarantee Green can, play that first, second mid week in, week out, whereas Warner could easily be chucked on the half-forward flank to utilise his goal-kicking prowess. But it's a tough one, but I think I'd probably pass on both realistically and move towards an LVU or Petrarca or those of the like, just because they feel a bit more safer. What were you going to say, James? Sorry.
Having said that, the one thing that really appeals about Tom Green is he's got Adelaide, Carlton, West Coast, Essendon, and Hawthorn in the first 5 games, none of which he'll cop that much attention, maybe from Caldwell or McGinnis, but I still can't see him scoring too poorly in those games. So he could start really well, but we know he'll probably start well. It's how he will finish the year. And when you are chasing rank or going for league, it's important how these players finish up. And for that reason, I'll probably skip as well, because we don't know how he closes out the year.
Yeah, exactly. I guess we're almost finished towards our midfielders for SuperCoach 23. But yeah, moving on to a bit more pricier uniques that I haven't seen too much spoken about. Obviously, so limited to the amount of uniques, amount of upper echelon premiums that we can select. But 2 of them, Callum Mills and Andrew Brayshaw, they're pride. Completely forgot to put the prices on for these last couple of slides. But they're priced towards that 6, which I think it was Mills about 640, I believe, and Brayshaw was about 620, I want to say, something along the lines of that. But obviously, Mills and Brayshaw were not spoken about as much. Mills probably more so than Brayshaw. Brayshaw's in a couple teams. But yeah, Mills obviously is so important for that Sydney midfield. He's one that pushes back the most and plays almost as an extra defender when they need him to be, and he almost just seems to score for fun. He obviously had that odd shit game here and there, but he was so consistent and was one of the very few that cracked a double 100, which only a few are capable of. And Andy Brayshaw is a big future for Fremantle. Can't afford to lose him, that's for sure. And was very consistent. And I think with the news of Fife moving forward or playing more permanently forward than midfield, can definitely help Brayshaw really consolidate himself as that number 1 midfielder for Freo. And he's obviously not reliant on things like goals. He's reliant more on a Jack Steele kind of game where he can just score based off his tackles alone. What are your thoughts on those 2 in particular? And do you think you can kind of select them with a bit of confidence ahead, even if you wanted to save money and pick him ahead of the likes of, say, your Bontempellis, McRae's, Olivers, and be a little bit different?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I'd be picking these players to maybe ahead of like a Cripps or a Petrarca, but I couldn't justify picking them over Oliver or Touk Miller necessarily, because with Mills, his role is so volatile. I mean, you can see the fluctuation between his highest and his lowest scoring. That's just purely based on where he was required to play in those 2 games. And with Brayshaw, I'm not too sure actually what his role is going to be. Like, he'll get plenty of midfield again, but with O'Meara coming in,
it's a big one.
potentially will get more time on ground, and he can only really play midfield. Does that see Brayshaw pushed a bit to the outside? I'm not too sure. I know with Miller, for instance, or Oliver, they're going to stay in the midfield and they're going to score pretty similarly. But Brayshaw, he's a very hard worker. I'm just, a bit uncertain on exactly how much mid-time he'll get. And so for that reason, I'd probably be selecting Mills over the two, because Mills shows the ability to still end up averaging decently even when he is put on the wing, which was actually a fair bit, or in defence, because he averages that out with some huge scoring. Would you lean towards Mills as well, or does the cheaper option of Brayshaw sort of entice you more?
Yeah, I think probably lean towards Mills a little bit more. I don't mind the cheaper option of Brayshaw. I just think that, as you said, Amira coming to that side, Amira basically can only play mid. Does that impact Brayshaw? I don't think it will too much. I think, if anything, it could benefit Brayshaw a bit. He might get the hands on the footy a bit more, even, with his already ridiculous 30-plus consistent possessions. But I think him, Sarong and Amira can definitely help a fair bit. But I think if I wanted to be a little bit unique, I don't have either of these two in my starting lineup, because I've got the 4 big boys in there at the moment, potentially 5 if I kind of adjust the cash elsewhere. I'll probably pick Mills and go for a bit of a risk. He's just capable of those huge scores. And he's one that, if you watch Sydney play on TV, it's pretty funny, because you don't actually see him too much. I don't notice him in games, but he just seems to rack it up like crazy.
Yeah,
and he's so consistent. He'll have the odd shit game, but I guess everyone does. But as I said, he's just capable of, when he gets it all together, he can score mammoth scores because of his huge work rate. And as I said, he's the first one back in defence. He's a link in the chain pretty much for Sydney, and they can't afford to lose him at all in the midfield. And he doesn't really play, if anything, he gets bumped into the defence where he just takes intercept marks and kick-outs and stuff like that. So, I go him, even though he's 640k, but I'm almost more confident with him and willing to take the risk with his huge scores that he does produce, once so often.
Interestingly, with these players, Brayshaw finished the season priced at 550k and Mills at 575k, which sort of suggests to me that or it proves the fact that they're both very volatile scorers and had their spike games towards the start of the year, which boosted their average. Like Brayshaw had his 189, I think it was in round 2 or something, and Mills had his in the first half of the year. So it shows that it's important that you pick players who have favourable matchups. And Mills, for instance, plays Hawthorn, who we went 214 on in round 2, and Brayshaw has a very soft fixture as well. So it might be handy to pick, say, one of these two in the hopes that they do score their spike game early on. But in saying that, you've also got to be aware that they're more susceptible to scoring low hundreds here or there, because they're just not the same sort of caliber of SuperCoach player as a Oliver or a Laird.
Yeah, that's a payoff you get for paying cheaper, essentially, that lack of high echelon consistency. But as Jonas said, if you notice they've got a weak fixture, it could even be worth it just to bank on those top scores and hope they're unique enough that not everyone is jumping on them. And usually, if you're able to jump on a unique early, then you're reaping the benefits, because everyone else jumps on them, and usually they don't get as big a score as they did in the unique round. So it's one that you just got to have a bit of foresight with potential fixtures, that's for sure. But I guess rounding off our midfielders, we won't talk about rookies, as I've said, in the defender one, because we'll be touching that on a separate podcast, potentially with a guest. But looking at the mid-price options, the most popular ones are the Dom Sheed versus Jacob Hopper debate, just because they're basically priced exactly the same and they had the same average. Obviously, Hopper had, I think, 5 games and Sheed only played the 1. They're both seemingly, or more so Dom Sheed, he seems to be bouncing back and dominating pre-season from what I've heard. And Hopper's obviously at a new club with minimal options in the midfield, where I think he can step into that role quite nicely with Taranto. Obviously hugely touted in both teams. Sheed had a pretty good year a couple of years back, but slid off a cliff quite considerably in the last couple. But what are your thoughts on those two? Obviously, I think I've got Hopper in my team personally, just because of a mid-price option. But do you think you could potentially go Dom Sheed over Hopper just because Sheed's got that track record of a pretty good average in previous years? And I think with the return of Nick Nat, do you think a ruckman like him fully fit can benefit the likes of, say, your Hoppers and Yos who were starved of opportunities, not only for injury, but form-wise as well, with how badly West Coast did in the COVID year in the last couple of years?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Definitely Hopper is someone you have to pick. It's no debate between him and Sheed. It's more a question of can you pick Sheed as well, because Hopper's still in his prime. He's going to play full-time midfield. He's in a good team. He's going to be averaging probably 85 plus as a bare minimum. With Sheed, I'm not sure really what role he's going to play. I've heard mixed reports. Like West Coast have come out and said he's performed really strongly in the match simulation, and then I read elsewhere that he was like slightly injured. So I think that's a bit of a wait and see. But if he's getting midfield minutes, he will be hard to pass up because he started really well a few years ago. I remember he came out of the blocks fast and made a bit of money, but then he fell away again. And this time around, he's like 2-3 years older. So he's one that's going to have to overly impress me in the preseason to be a viable selection. I'd rather say select Hopper and then go down to, say, a Will Phillips or an Ashcroft and maybe bank on a mid-pricer in another line, because there are plenty of good options in the midfield. But is Sheed someone you consider yourself being able to fit into your team, or is he just too injury prone?
Yeah, it's a tough one because I think you're probably going to have one or the other. I think if you have both, it's going to blow up in your face a little bit just because there is a lot of risk attached. More so with Dom Sheed than Hopper. Hopper, you can probably more confidently say he's going to play prime midfield minutes because Richmond have in previous seasons kind of had to make do with a midfield that predominantly involves likes of Dusty and Shai Bolton, who played better forward. So I think Taranto, Hopper are mainstays in that midfield for, X amount of years moving forward. Sheed's one that, he's capable of scoring well. It's just we haven't seen it consistently in a while now. And obviously that's pretty heavily correlated with the crap that West Coast has had to go through, COVID and injuries and what have you. But it'd be nice to see him and Yo pull it back together, and Nick Nat and the rucker could provide a seriously good midfield if they get Shuey fit as well, as kind of one last hurrah for those guys who are going on age a bit. I'd almost, take the risk if I was forced to, if you had, say, like a Hopper who's in most people's teams I've seen, and say a Fife, I'd almost go Sheed over Fife in some regards because, Sheed's more likely to play midfield and Fife is playing predominantly forward and he's kind of lacked that match fitness, and you always worry about Fife's injury history. But I think realistically, I'd definitely pick Hopper over Sheed, and I think I'd probably pick only the one because I think there's just so much risk attached with these 330k players. You could argue that they look good on paper, and there's people like guys like Hunter Clark and Nat Fife have been premiums or premium price in years gone by, but you've got to take into consideration their recent form, and there's a reason why they're priced so cheaply at 330 odd K for all of them, or 313 I think for Fife and Hunter Clark. But I think, as you put it correctly, I think Hopper's probably the way to go. Anything to add before we wrap it up in regards to any other midfielders that you think might be worth looking carefully in pre-season, or do you think we've covered most of them?
I think, we've covered most. I mean, you can go unique, but usually it blows up in your face if you pick someone around the 450k mark who's unique. For instance, if you're picking like a Sarong or a Chera or someone like that, whilst they might seem appealing for certain reasons, they're more prone to scoring a 70 or an 80. So in the midfield, literally just keep it simple. Pick a few very popular players, for instance, Oliver. And if you want like a point of difference, pick one, but pick one who you're confident is going to score well. For instance, if you expect Callum Mills to get more mid time, by all means, then go for the pick, because he's going to have now a full pre-season without that Achilles injury, so there is potentially upside. But yeah, I'd be flirting more with danger in some of the other lines, like for instance the back line, a few options that we discussed in the last episode, who can make or break your team. But if you get those right and just keep it simple in your midfield, pick those guys who are able to score 115, 120, it should set you up well.
Yeah, I think Jonas nailed on Laird. I think midfield's one that you don't want to play too stupidly with, just because you could fall significantly behind the 8 ball if you don't have those kind of anywhere between 8 to 10 or even 8 to kind of top 12 midfielders. Because you may think that a 5 to 10 point decrease per player isn't significant, but it starts to add up, especially if you miss out on some of the key midfielders. But I think that's all we got time for today. I know this is a bit of a long one, but there's obviously a fair few midfielders to go through, and it's the biggest line to pick in your teams. Obviously, next one will be the rucks, which will be definitely an interesting discussion to have. Being a midfielder, supporting myself, what the hell we do with Marshall and the like moving forward, and obviously Darcy Cameron as well for the Collingwood supporters out there. We'll see if Nathan's available. I know that he's working the Australian Open and he's copped the night shifts, which make it a little bit hard for him to be involved at the moment, but we'll try and get him on. If not, it'll be me and Jonas rounding out the rucks and forwards, and moving forward, we'll have a rookie review at some point towards the back end of pre-season, and yeah, looking forward to revealing our round 1 starting sides, that's for sure, leading into March. But yeah, until then, we'll catch you for the Ruck Pods.